He didn't just protect the cartel, he militarized it. On Matamoros, Tamaulipas, a sun-scorched border town where the Gulf licks the edge of Mexico like a serpent, and the wind carries whispers instead of hope. This isn't paradise. This is where power doesn't wear a crown. It wears a gun. Osiel Cárdenas Guillén was never supposed to rule anything. He wasn't born into wealth or war. He didn't grow up in palaces or prisons. He grew up under the hood of a car, a mechanic by trade, hands blackened by oil, clothes soaked in sweat. He fixed engines during the day and drank away silence at night. But even in that quiet garage, something was stirring, a hunger, not for money, not even respect, but control. Osiel watched the streets. He listened to drunk narcos talk too loud. He saw who owed what to whom. He learned that in Matamoros, everyone was one bad deal away from disappearing. And in the early 1990s, the Gulf Cartel, once one of the most powerful criminal networks in the region, was bleeding out. Its leaders were either dead, locked up, or too scared to leave their houses. The throne sat empty, and Osiel didn't ask to sit on it. He took it, not through negotiation, not with alliances, but with execution. One by one, the rivals vanished. Those who opposed him found themselves staring down gun barrels or waking up in ditches if they woke up at all. He wasn't subtle, he wasn't graceful, but he was effective. His rise wasn't political, it was surgical, and every cut he made sent a message. This isn't a democracy, this is mine now. He didn't just remove threats, he redefined loyalty. To Osiel, silence was loyalty, obedience was loyalty, and fear was loyalty in its purest form. That's how a grease-stained mechanic became a cartel king, not by luck, but by turning paranoia into policy, and ambition into bloodshed. They called him El Mata Amigos, the friend killer, not because it sounded scary, but because it was true. Osiel Cárdenas didn't trust anyone, not his soldiers, not his lieutenants, not even the men who helped him rise to power. Because to him, loyalty wasn't something you earned. It was something you enforced, with fear, with pain, with death. His paranoia wasn't a weakness, it was his religion. If he even suspected betrayal, it was over. You didn't get a warning. You didn't get a chance to explain. You disappeared. Sometimes your body turned up, sometimes it didn't. But your name always vanished from the cartel's vocabulary, like you never existed. That's how Osiel ruled, through erasure. He wasn't just eliminating threats. He was controlling memory. In the early days of his reign, Osiel surrounded himself with trusted men, people he had grown up with, worked alongside, shared meals with. But trust has a short half-life in the drug trade. And in Osiel's world, it had none. He executed partners over rumors. He killed old friends for talking to cops, or just looking like they might. Once, it's said, a lieutenant joked about Osiel being too paranoid. The next day, that man was found hanging from a bridge with a sign on his chest. Loyalty is not a joke. He didn't build networks. He built fear silos, isolated cells of operatives, none of whom fully understood how deep the structure ran. Information was power, and Osiel kept it tightly rationed. Only he knew everything. Everyone else? Just enough to follow orders, not enough to ask questions. This wasn't leadership. This was dictatorship, and yet it worked. Because in the chaos of cartel warfare, a man who kills his friends terrifies his enemies. By the late 1990s, Osiel Cárdenas was no longer just a name whispered on Matamoros street corners. He had become a myth wrapped in muscle. The man who could smile at you one day and put you in the ground the next. And what terrified people most? He didn't kill out of rage, he killed out of calculation. He had rules, he just broke them when it suited him. Because in Osiel's world, every man was a tool. and some tools are only useful once. Respect me, fear me, but never think I won't bury you. That was the gospel of the friend killer, a king who wore his crown like a blade, sharp, silent, and always ready to fall. Osiel had the money, he had the roots, he had the fear, but he wanted something more, something no other cartel boss had ever dreamed of owning, a real army. Because in his mind, traffickers were too soft. They bragged in clubs, spent like kings, and died like fools. Osiel didn't want gangsters. He wanted soldiers, so he reached deep into the heart of the Mexican military and pulled out its most dangerous men. It started with a whisper. A few pesos slid across a cantina table. A conversation held in shadows. An offer too dangerous to ignore and too rich to refuse. These weren't street thugs. They were GAFE, Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, Mexico's elite counter-narcotics commandos. Men trained by the U.S., taught to survive torture, ambush, jungle warfare. Killers in uniform, patriots turned mercenaries. One by one, they walked away from the flag and into the darkness of Osiel's payroll. He called them Los Zetas, the Z unit, named after their radio code. At first, they were just bodyguards, but that didn't last. Because these men didn't just protect Osiel. They reshaped the cartel. They brought tactics, discipline, intel networks, sniper training, urban assault strategies, and cruelty so precise, it felt scientific. They didn't shoot to scare. They shot to send messages. Beheadings, dismemberments, executions filmed and distributed like press releases. Before Los Zetas, cartel violence was personal, messy, emotional, unpredictable. After Los Zetas, it was a doctrine, structured, efficient, industrial. Osiel had built more than an armed wing. He had built a prototype for modern narco-terrorism, and the world started to notice. DEA agents whispered about Mexican commandos gone rogue. The Mexican government feared confronting them head-on. Even rival cartels began copying their model, creating their own paramilitary enforcers to keep up. Los Zetas turned the Gulf Cartel into something far more terrifying than a drug business. They made it a war machine. Checkpoints, convoys, ambushes, tactical raids on police stations. They didn't just fight for territory, they conquered it. And through it all, Osiel sat at the top, not with gold chains or flashy suits, but with a radio in one hand and killers on speed dial. What he unleashed couldn't be undone. Because once you teach men to kill with discipline and no conscience, you can't ask them to stop. Osiel had created a weaponized brotherhood, loyal only to power and trained to obey no one but the highest bidder. Before Osiel, cartels had gunmen. After Osiel, they had armies. And once the doors to that darkness were opened, Mexico would never close them again. Osiel Cárdenas didn't just deal in drugs, he dealt in fear. Where other kingpins used violence to punish, Osiel used it to organize, because to him, terror wasn't a side effect, it was the strategy. And in his world, brutality wasn't random. It was deliberate, structured, predictable, like a business model built on blood. If someone stole from him, they weren't just killed, they were displayed. Hands chopped off, tongues nailed to walls, bodies strung from bridges with signs around their necks. This is what happens when you cross the boss. He didn't just punish betrayal, he broadcast it. Fear was his press secretary, and pain, his signature. If a cop tried to do their job, Osiel didn't bribe just that officer. He bought their entire unit. And if someone refused, they disappeared. Sometimes with their family, sometimes as a message to their family. Entire police stations were wiped out in single nights, whole towns silenced overnight. He didn't need to kill everyone. He just needed people to believe he might. And that belief, that whisper in the dark, was more powerful than any bullet. But here's where it gets complicated. Osiel wasn't just feared, he was respected. By the poor, by the forgotten, by those for whom the government was just a rumor. In neighborhoods abandoned by the state, Osiel showed up with food, with medicine, with bags of cash after hurricanes and droughts. He built roads, funded schools, paid for funerals. To many in Matamoros, he wasn't a criminal. He was a savior in combat boots. And that's what made him so dangerous, because he didn't just rule with terror. He ruled with gratitude. He understood something most warlords never grasp. A bullet can silence a man, but a full stomach buys silence forever. He blurred the lines between cartel and community, between villain and protector, and in doing so, he made it impossible to tell where the fear ended and the loyalty began. His rivals couldn't compete. They offered nothing but chaos. But Osiel, he offered order. A brutal, bloody kind of order. But order nonetheless. People didn't love him in spite of the violence. They loved him because of it. Because in a country where justice never arrived, where the law showed up late and left early, Osiel showed up with answers, even if they came at the barrel of a gun. He didn't conquer through bullets alone. He conquered through perception, through the illusion that he was the only one who gave a damn. And in a land where no one else did, that illusion was enough to build an empire. By 2003, Osiel Cárdenas Guillén wasn't just a drug lord. He was a sovereign. A warlord in fatigues, ruling a territory with radios, rifles, and raw fear. He didn't hide in jungles or mountains. He didn't live like a fugitive. He walked the streets of Matamoros like he owned them, because in many ways he did. Local politicians feared him. Police worked for him. Citizens whispered his name like it was a curse or a prayer. But every empire has cracks, and Osiel's wasn't bulletproof. The beginning of the end came not from a rival cartel, but from a decision made years earlier. The day he pulled 2 DEA agents from their car at gunpoint in Matamoros. That moment, reckless and arrogant, painted a target on his back, not from rival narcos, but from the United States of America. The DEA wanted him. The FBI wanted him. And the Mexican government, under pressure from the White House, was now willing to play ball. So the net tightened. Agents infiltrated his lieutenants. Trafficking routes were traced. Informants were flipped. Satellites tracked his convoys. And slowly, the myth began to shrink. Because no matter how many sicarios you have, you can't kill a satellite. Then came the moment. March 14th, 2003. Tamaulipas, Mexico. Mexican special forces cornered Osiel in the heart of his own kingdom. Surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. The man who once threatened federal agents with death surrendered without firing a single shot. No last stand, no glorious gunfight, no blaze of bullets. Just silence. And for the first time in years, Osiel was no longer in control. He was taken into custody. The photos showed a man no longer invincible, handcuffed, exhausted, staring down the camera like it owed him something. They locked him up in Mexico at first, but everyone knew that wouldn't last. Osiel had too many friends, too many bribes waiting in envelopes, too many guards willing to look the other way. So in 2007, he was quietly extradited to the United States. No ceremony, no headlines. Just one more ghost in chains. In a Texas courtroom, the king of Matamoros stood trial. No camouflage, no sicarios. Just suits, judges, and cold, hard evidence. He pled guilty to drug trafficking on an industrial scale, money laundering threatening U.S. federal agents running a cartel like a war machine. In 2010, they sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison. And just like that, the Mad King was gone. But here's the twist. That wasn't the end, because the real punishment wasn't the prison bars. It was what happened next, what he left behind. Osiel thought he could control the monster he built, but once he was gone, Los Zetas, his elite death squad, cut the leash. They splintered off, became their own cartel, and turned on their creators like wolves off the chain. Suddenly, Mexico wasn't just at war with drug traffickers. It was at war with soldiers trained to kill like professionals, but loyal to no one. The violence Osiel had once used as a weapon became a wildfire. His fall didn't stop the bloodshed, it accelerated it. Because when you take the king off the board, but leave his army behind, the game doesn't end, it explodes. Osiel was gone. Caged. Silenced. Forgotten by headlines. But the Gulf Cartel didn't die. Because Osiel didn't build a cartel. He built a system, a blueprint designed to survive without him, and prepared for his return. From inside prison, his voice still echoed. Through visitors, through lawyers, through coded phone calls and hidden messages, he wasn't just behind bars, he was behind the curtain. Even in confinement, Osiel maintained command. Lieutenants deferred to his word. Rivalries were settled in his name. Executions were approved with a nod from his prison cell. And as the government celebrated his capture, his organization kept functioning like a machine. Cold, ruthless, fully operational. The streets still ran with product. The violence didn't stop. The fear didn't fade because Osiel didn't need freedom to rule. He just needed obedience. But outside the walls, something else was happening. While Osiel sat in the shadows, his creation, Los Zetas, grew bolder, more independent, more ambitious. They had once been his loyal guards. Now they wanted their own throne, and in the chaos of that ambition, a civil war erupted between the Gulf Cartel and the Zetas. Once allies, now enemies. Shooting each other in the streets they once ruled together. The violence spiraled, bodies on highways, grenades in nightclubs, mass graves in forgotten fields. And through it all there was still one name whispered in both camps. El Patron is coming back. In the criminal underworld, time doesn't erase power. It amplifies it. Osiel had become a legend, the imprisoned warlord, the silent godfather, a myth surrounded by barbed wire. And in 2010, when his sentencing came down in the U.S., 25 years, many thought that was the final chapter. But they were wrong, because prison didn't kill his influence. It crystallized it. His name still opened doors, still closed mouths, still pulled the trigger on people he never met. Meanwhile, others began claiming pieces of his throne. New bosses, new flags, the Trevino brothers in the Zetas, Tony Tormenta, Osiel's own brother, holding down the Gulf side. But none of them could wear the crown like he did, because Osiel wasn't just respected. He was feared by the men who trained the killers. And as the years passed, something darker unfolded. The monster he created kept mutating. Each new leader more violent, more unstable. What began as a structured criminal empire became a blood-soaked free-for-all. Entire cities became war zones, civilians caught in crossfire, mothers searching for sons who vanished into the desert. And all of it, still carried the fingerprints of one man. Osiel never physically returned to his throne, but the throne never left him. Even inside a federal prison cell in the U.S., he remained the spiritual architect of the violence tearing Mexico apart. Because true power isn't where you sit, it's how deep your shadow runs. And Osiel's shadow stretched across borders, across prison walls, across entire generations of killers. He didn't need to escape. He already built the world he wanted, and from behind steel and concrete, he kept the kingdom bleeding. For years, Osiel's empire thrived in the shadows, smuggling billions in cocaine, heroin, meth, and terror, while the rest of the world barely blinked. But shadows don't last forever. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, something shifted. The violence became too loud to ignore, too brutal, too public, too close to the border. Bodies were turning up not just in Mexico, but near U.S. soil. Torture houses discovered minutes from Texas towns. Shootouts echoing across the Rio Grande. Suddenly, the chaos Osiel once controlled with surgical fear was bleeding across borders. And that's when the world finally turned to look. It started with a single incident, a moment that made headlines, but more importantly, changed strategy. November 9th, 1999, Matamoros. Two American agents, one from the DEA, the other from the FBI, were following up on a lead. A standard operation, low profile, until it wasn't. Osiel's men spotted them, intercepted them, blocked their path with trucks, rifles, and cold eyes. Within seconds, the agents were surrounded. Dozens of cartel gunmen pointing assault rifles at their heads in broad daylight. And at the center of it all, Osiel himself. He stepped out of his vehicle, calm, director, and told them plainly, "You're in my city. I decide who lives and dies here." He could have pulled the trigger. He wanted to, but something made him stop. Maybe instinct, maybe strategy. Maybe he didn't want the full weight of the U.S. government crashing down on him. Yet, whatever the reason, he let them go. And in doing so, he lit the match. Because those agents didn't just survive, they reported. And the U.S. response wasn't subtle. A $2 million bounty was placed on Osiel's head. He was labeled one of the most dangerous criminals in the Western Hemisphere. And the hunt began. But it wasn't just America watching now. Interpol, Europol, Latin American governments. Everyone turned their gaze toward Matamoros, Tamaulipas, and toward the man they now called the Friend Killer. Journalists started connecting the dots. Reports surfaced of mass graves, disappearances, tortured witnesses. Local newspapers that dared print his name were firebombed or shut down. Osiel's name became unprintable in Mexico, not by law, but by terror. In some towns, even whispering about him was a death sentence. He wasn't just a cartel leader anymore. He was a myth wrapped in real blood. And in the U.S., the narrative shifted. No longer just a Mexican drug problem. Now it was a national security threat. The Gulf Cartel became a priority for the DEA, FBI, Homeland Security, even the CIA. And Osiel's photo, once unknown, was now pinned to every war room corkboard from Langley to Langosta. But here's the irony. The more the world watched him, the more powerful he became, because attention validated the myth, gave him weight, made him a legend to the next generation of sicarios. They saw him not as a villain, but as the blueprint for power. Young men across Mexico began calling themselves Zetas, started copying his tactics, trying to live up to the monster the world feared. And Osiel? He watched it all unfold from a jail cell. Like a playwright watching the first act of his own horror story, he wanted to be invisible. But in chasing total control, he became unignorable. And once the eyes of the world turned to Mexico's most feared warlord, they never looked away again. Osiel didn't lose control. He created something that could never be controlled. A man who brought the military into the drug war and left behind a battlefield that still bleeds.